So we just did our first kind of the pattern designing Q&A videos, and I couldn't really figure out how to record from like the website I was using. I had it on auto record in the settings, and so I thought that it would just automatically record, and it didn't. But I was running this camera for most of the time that I was answering questions. So I'm gonna put this up, and it's basically just gonna look like I'm talking to myself. But I mean, you won't be able to hear the questions that they are asking me, but you'll be able to hear me answer. So maybe I'll like put it in the description at timestamps at like what kind of question I'm answering. So I'm sorry that that kind of failed. I will definitely make sure to do like 2 different methods of recording to double check next time. But it was really fun, so we're definitely going to do more. And I hope that even though it's not, you know, the best recording this time around, I hope that you can find something of value in it. And yeah, let me know what you think, and please be kind. It'll be better next time, I promise. I just didn't understand how to use this program. So yeah, have a great rest of your Saturday. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Okay, sorry, I had to switch computers. Let me turn the video on. Alright, hi. I think we're still waiting on one more person, but I mean, we can go ahead and get started if you guys want to. So whoever wants to go first, maybe introduce yourself and then yeah, ask your question. Yeah, so you can hear me, right? Okay, so I typically start out with a drawing, so I pulled one out so that you can see. It's not very like great, but this is what I usually do. So I start out with a drawing, and I kind of draw the shape that I want. So different shapes fit differently. So like I prefer seamless because I think it's easier to design typically, like a raglan or a yoke, and I like the way that they fit. But when I first started out, I think I started with seamed because it's easier to write because you do it in pieces. And so for me, if it was like a block, it was easier to design. And so the resources I typically use stitch dictionaries. I don't really come up with like my own stitches, and I don't really feel like there's that many that haven't been discovered. I mean, some people I've seen have started doing their own, but most of the time they're in a stitch dictionary. So I start with that. I usually go and find inspiration in one of my stitch dictionaries, and then I'll draw it out and include it like I did. And this one I have like drop stitches drawn here. And I'll draw it out, and I'll figure out kind of if it needs to be a multiple of something. So I'm working on a pattern right now there where in the round it needs to be worked in a multiple of 6. But then for each panel up in the yoke, it needs to be a multiple of 6 plus 4 to be symmetrical. So then it's kind of playing with that and figuring out, okay, how can I do the math where everything works out to be a multiple of 6? And so typically what I do is I start out with like sizing information. I'm like, okay, I want these 8 sizes or whatever. And then I figure out, okay, what is the closest to my gauge that I can get a multiple of 6, kind of. And then could you repeat the next part of your question that I haven't answered? I feel like a lot of it's a personal preference. Like I don't like doing bottom up, so I typically do top down. But it also depends on the direction of your stitches. So certain like color work panels look better if they're worked bottom up than top down. So I think a lot of sweaters, if they start bottom up, it's because they want the direction of the stitches to be going up, if that makes sense. And a lot of times, like I've seen people where they want the stitch pattern in the yoke to go angling up, but they still kind of want to work it top down. So what I've seen people do is they will will like work one band close to the arms in a yoke and then work down and then do like have it be a provisional cast on and go up so that they get that directional angle of those stitches. But I think also it's a lot of it's personal preference. Like a couple times I've seen people do yoke sweaters where they do bottom up and then you join like both sleeves and the body to work the yoke and finish. And I personally don't like that, and I think a lot of people don't like that because it's hard to get the sleeve measurement correct. Because if you're starting with the sleeve at the beginning, then if it doesn't fit, you'll have to probably like pick up around the wrist and go back the other direction. So I think that's why a lot of people do top down, is because they want to kind of get everything to like fit right. And that's the same thing with the body. If you start bottom up and you don't like the length, then it's harder to change than if you do top down and go down, because you can kind of fix all those length issues. And it's just, I think, easier to get the hard math out of the way by doing a top down. So the yoke is the hard part. So once the yoke is done, then the rest of the math is really easy. Does that answer your question? Okay. I hope you can't tell I'm still wearing my PJ pants. But, so my favorites that I like to use are actually the first ones I found, and they're called the Harmony Guides. So volume 2 is my favorite. That's the one I use most often. But I also have volume 4 and volume 3. So they kind of look like that. And then another one I really like is Barbara Walker's Treasury of Knitting Patterns. And I have several of those. Or I'm sorry, I have one, but she has several of those. I think there's 4 or 5 that she has, but they're kind of expensive, so I only have the one. So I think these are probably around $30 each, and the Harmony Guides are cheaper, probably about $10 to $15. But the second Treasury of Knitting Patterns is really great. That one's my favorite, and it's just, there's so many. It's all in black and white, but there's just so many in here. So that one's my favorite. And there's lots that overlap, though, because there's only so many stitches. But another one that someone gifted me is called Up, Down, All Around Stitch Dictionary. It's by Wendy Bernard. And I can put all this in an email for you guys as well. But that one is good because it gives you like one stitch and it'll tell you how to work it flat, how to work it bottom up, top down, and in the round. So you get just lots of different ways. So that way you don't have to convert something that's flat into something that's in the round. So those are definitely my favorite. And as for like knitting books that I like, there's not a whole lot that I use. I mean, I know there's lots out there and lots that people find very helpful, but I actually find Googling things and finding blog posts a lot easier. Like I have a ton of books and I almost never crack them open, or I crack them open and then I'm like, this isn't what I was looking for. So most of what I use is finding one online. Let me grab a couple that are pretty useful though. So the one that I found when I was first learning to design is called Knitting from the Top by Barbara Walker. It's this one right here, and it's like a really old one from like the 80s, I think. But she's the same woman that made the Treasury of Knitting Patterns book. So she is really, really talented. Hers is really good because it kind of gives an introduction into top-down sweater constructions. And I mean, hers are pretty basic, I think, and it's not super specific. So there's some tweakings and some things that you'll learn through knitting sweaters that you can adapt this, but it's a very good place to start. And then there's a book called Sweater Design in Plain English by Maggie Righetti, which is good. I don't use it very often, but I see a lot of people online who are designers who do. So I think people find that one helpful. And then Another one that has helped occasionally is called Knitting Pattern Essentials by Sally Melville. And one more that I found that is just kind of an interesting one. I actually just bought this about 2 weeks ago, so I haven't really had time to dive into it. But it's a Vogue knitting book called 6,000 Plus Pullover Possibilities by Melissa Liebman. And it just gives you tons of different styles of doing necklines and button bands and pockets and edgings. So it's kind of a cool way to embellish or kind of accessorize your design. So I thought that one was really cool. But I hope that answers your question. And then I don't think that we ever got our third person. So if that answers all your question, we can move on to Breanna, and then we can just open it up to more questions if you guys want. Like, do I use a common gauge, or do I just block it and see what gauge it shows up to be? Is that your question? Yeah, I just block it and see what gauge it ends up being. I think you typically, with like stockinette and garter, end up with similar gauges. That's why you see a lot of like fingering weight sweaters that are knit at a 24 stitch gauge and worsted weight sweaters that are knit at a 20 stitch gauge. That's very common. But I think once you get into like more like differing stitch patterns, ones that are not just plain stockinette, you just make a big swatch and block it and base everything off of that instead of looking at a common stitch gauge and going off of that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what I do when I'm translating something from like one size to another is, I wish it was as easy as like just multiply it by like 1.2. That would be really nice. But what I do is I have to do a gauge swatch for every single size. So every single like yarn weight. So I do a gauge swatch for like fingering, DK, and worsted. So I made a hat a few months ago, and it came in 3 different weights, and I had to make 3 different gauge swatches and come up with 3 different gauges. And you just have to do the math separately for every weight. So it does take some time, but basically what I'll do is I'll come up with a general size. So for a hat, that's easier because most people have around the same size head. So it's like 21 inches for women and 23 inches for men. And so you'll take your gauge and you'll try and make it around that size for each gauge that you have, if that makes sense. Yeah, no problem. How far back did you hear, so I can repeat it? It depends on the person. Can you still hear me? Okay. So it depends on the person, and when I first started out, I would do the math for one size and then knit up my sample and then create all the other sizes from that. But now I do it where I write up every size before I even begin, and then I go and knit my sample. And I'll tell you the benefit to doing all of it up front is that your sample that you knit up will be exactly the same as it should be. Whereas if you if you knit it up first and then write it up, you can sometimes have like, oh, I need to change this afterwards, and then your sample is slightly different. So if like you want to start just with your version first, that's totally fine. I found that easier when I was first designing to like just do the math for one size first and then convert. But if you can do it with all sizes first, I think that is more beneficial in the long run. So yeah, so basically what I do is I go into an Excel spreadsheet and I have all my sizes. And I've done enough sweaters that I have kind of a size range that I like to work with. So I typically do about 4 inches between each size. So I'll start at a 32 and then a 36 and then a 40 and on up into the mid 60s. And I have like different sizing charts that I refer to, which I can share with you guys. And that is kind of how I base it off of that. So I'll go in and say like, I need a 40 inch let's say I need a 40-inch bust and I have 5 stitches to the inch. I can't do that math in my head, I'm sorry. So what is that? Is that 100 stitches? And if anyone's checking. So I'll go in and I'll say, okay, I need 40 inches around, and I have 5 stitches per 1 inch. So 5 times, I did that wrong, didn't I? 5 times 40, not 20. 5 times 40 is 200 stitches. And so that's how many stitches I would cast on for my body, if that makes sense. And so I do it in an Excel spreadsheet, so it does all the math for me, because as you can tell, I'm terrible at it. So I will go in and I will say, okay, this is I'll put in like my stitch count at the very top row, and then I'll do my row count, and then I will do the like sizes that I want, so like 32, 36, 40, and then I multiply. I have it do like a multiply by the stitch count by the bust, and it'll give you the total number of stitches below. And you can do the same thing for the arms. So if you want a 12-inch circumference for the arms, you just multiply it by your stitch count per 1 inch, and it will give you the amount of stitches that you need. And so I can do a more in-depth video on how to do like basic grading kind of, but that's basically how I do it. I do it all in an Excel spreadsheet, which I cannot recommend enough. I used to do it all pen and paper, and the amount of mistakes that could have been solved with Excel is incredible. It used to take me like 3 months to grade a sweater, and now it can take me like 2 days because of Excel. So it is an amazing thing. Just watching some tutorials on how to do basic like adding, subtracting, and multiplying in Excel is really great. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. Well, then I think if you guys just have any more follow-up questions or anything you want to ask, I think we have time for it, because I haven't heard from that other person. So. Yeah, I think in the beginning, it's mostly you going after people, and then after you've made some designs, it'll start to be the other way around. So if you have like any kind of social following, like if you've got, even just 20 people on Instagram, reaching out to them and asking, okay, can you guys test knit for me? And I know there's also groups on Ravelry where you can find test knitters. So if you don't know where to go, that's always a good place. And Facebook groups, actually. I just found that out, that you can go and like search like test knitters on Facebook and find groups where you can post opportunities and you can find people. And then as for tech editing's kind of, you'll have to go after people. I think I've only gotten 1 or 2 people asking if they could have me use their services. But I like to kind of go after and see what people specialize in, because I want someone who is good with like sweaters, or if I'm doing brioche, I want someone who understands brioche. So I did that through a basic Google search. Like I just looked for knitting tech editors and found a few people. And then I also found some people through, again, like Ravelry groups. And I would guess that there's probably people on Facebook as well. I haven't checked, but I would be surprised if there weren't. And then as far as yarn support goes, I think you can just typically you can go to people and give them the idea that you have and say, will you provide yarn support? And in the beginning they might say yes, or they might say no, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged. Like, keep going after people and asking if they will. And I think that the big box companies are more willing to give you yarn. So like Lion Brand, and I know loveknitting.com does a lot of that, or I think it's Love Crafts now, but they're very good with it. If you go to them with an idea, they're pretty likely to give you yarn support. And then the more that you do it, then you can ask more people, and I think they'll give you yarn support. Yeah, but it depends. Like, I've never had like a contract or anything where I've like signed anything with people. It's just always been kind of like can you give me yarn support? Here's my idea. I'm not the right person to ask. I'm really bad at that. Caitlin Hunter's Zweig sweater. Have you seen that? She's got a bunch of lace up here in the yoke, and it increases, and I do not understand it at all. Like, I cannot do it. Everything I do has nothing to do with that because that's too complex. But I think if you have a good understanding of charts and you can read charts, then I think that's how people do it, is they can visualize it in a chart and then they can place their increases while keeping the pattern. I think that's how they do it, but I'm not positive. I've looked up a lot of stuff and I can't find anything. So I think you'll have to practice and play around with that one. I think you promote them on any social media platform that you have, and I find it helpful to do like a little introductory coupon, but you definitely don't have to. If people like the design, they're going to buy it anyway. So definitely promote it on any of your social media platforms and like promote it in advance. Something I found that's really helpful is like kind of counting down to a release. So you get like 5 days ahead, and that day you're like 5 more days until this release, and then 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then you're like tomorrow. And that really helps because it keeps it in people's mind and they can remember it. And then just keep promoting it for a little while. I don't know if this is actually true, but I've read that, people need to see something about 7 times before they truly will click on it. So there's that. And then there's also groups on Ravelry, like forums, where you can post new patterns and people look through that forum to find new patterns and look for discounts. So that's a great way to do it. There's also, I think you can take out like a $10 a month ad on Ravelry. So you could do stuff like that. That's also, I haven't been able to get the pictures to be the right size, but I think that would be a good place to start. I've done Instagram promotions, but I didn't find it to be worth it, so I wouldn't suggest that one. Like, I think it's a big waste of money. And then if you can get like an email marketing list, that is a really great thing. So what I do is I kind of give different amounts of discounts depending on the platform. So Instagram, which is probably the least exclusive, and I mean exclusive as in like you have to do the most effort for it, or the least effort for Instagram, so I give them 15%. And then my podcast, which is a little bit more effort to find and to keep up with for people, I give them 20%, kind of as like a reward for, making that extra effort. And then I have a newsletter, and that gets 25%. And then I also post in Ravelry forums and give like 15% as well. And on Ravelry, you can give different names to promotions. So you can see, okay, where are the sales coming from? Are they coming from Instagram, YouTube, Ravelry, or your newsletter? And I use MailChimp. I think that's a really great free service to use. It's free up until a point. But that's a good one to have. What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry. Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know. It's not a very lucrative business. I haven't found it to be super profitable. So I could not do this full time if I didn't have support systems. Like if I was the only one making the money, it wouldn't work. I'd have to have supplementary income. But because like I live with my husband and we have like portioned out, okay, I contribute this much, it's able to work because of that. And I've heard that from other designers too. Like I've seen interviews and read blog posts where they say for them it's not, a super profitable business. But if you really love it and you're able to, I think it's such a hard thing to know. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's such a personal decision and depending on things. So if you have, you don't need to be the breadwinner and you don't need to be the one that brings in all the income and your family's, groceries are dependent on your income. I think it's easier to go full time. but if I don't know, you might have to diversify and do like teaching as well as patterns. I've never taught, so I don't know what the income is like with that, but yeah, you probably have to find ways to diversify your income a little bit to make it worthwhile. But if you really love it, I think it's definitely worth going full-time. Like once it kind of feels right, once you don't have to work so hard to get people to buy patterns, like once it just starts to, like, people start to kind of recognize your patterns, I think that's a good indicator of it's probably time to go full-time. Yeah. All right, any more? I think we're getting close to our cutoff time, but yeah, this was so fun. It was really great to chat with you guys. I'm glad that I got to like meet you, not quite in person, but a little bit more in person than, you know, behind a keyboard. So yeah, thanks for doing this. Yeah. Well, have a great rest of your Saturday. Yeah, I hope to see you guys online in other places. Yeah, you too.